Thanks for joining us to talk a bit about how the press has been covering the coronavirus pandemic in a time of strained resources for the news media. This is a pivotal time in our democracy for the role of the press to provide clear and trusted information. If not us, the press, then who? First, let us introduce ourselves. We have had some interaction with some of you, and we welcome you back. I'm Cindy Skrzycki on the right, and David Shribman. We've both been journalists for about 40 years, and we're in a position to talk about the revolutionary changes that have happened in news gathering and distribution from the beginning of the press, when America was becoming independent from Britain, to now when a tweet can be as important as a 1,500-word story or a comment from the president on the pandemic, which reporters then have to interpret and cover. Then as now, an understanding of history is crucial, as events in history have propelled the growth of the press from pamphlets to broadsheets to digital design. And it's that digital world that we live in for tweeting, sites, everything else that reporters are dealing with. So let's start with some history that David will take you through. And then I'll talk about the current issues in the financial structure of the press that are being affected by the pandemic, and how that allows reporters to cover, highlight important issues in the pandemic, and have enough staff and expertise to interpret data, talk about the science, and also apply to people's everyday lives. It's a big job, and it just got bigger with the flu. So it isn't only humans who are being ravaged by the current health emergency. It's news outlets, particularly in the United States, that are collateral damage to the scourge of the coronavirus. There have been tectonic shifts in the American media landscape in the past decade. There have been major shifts in the American media landscape in the past month, big ones. The combination has produced a continuing upheaval in how Americans report the news, American reporters, how Americans and people around the world receive the news, how we pay for the news, how we use the news, and finally, how we define what news is. And that's an interesting question, because very recently, some of the TV networks like CNN, NBC, have decided that they will not carry all President Trump's news conferences or briefings on the coronavirus. They cut out when he starts talking about personal things, other things like our defense is completely object. They've then decided when he goes to Q&A, wings in methods, excuse me, that they are going to broadcast. Now, this is the first time that I can think of in history where the press was sort of censoring itself. They want to take the broadcast and be able to ascertain what they should actually show viewers that is true. Okay. At no other time in recent history have these questions become more urgent as the press, strapped for cash, tries to keep up and get ahead of the events of the day with the virus. That is, how to deliver devastating news on a minute-by-minute basis without people tuning out. How to cover the world at a time when the ranks of foreign correspondents have been severely diminished. Who do you have in Italy? How to avoid bias in coverage of an issue that has been politicized. How to constantly bring a new lens to coverage of a tragedy that's happening on multiple fronts and politically. And most importantly, how do you pay for this? How do news organizations pay for all this additional coverage when advertisers have nothing to advertise because of the flu? Losing my voice, excuse me. In other words, they don't have ads for restaurants, movies, events, nothing. There's none of that revenue coming in, yet the demand is much higher. In the meantime, the crisis has created have and have-nots in the media world. For giants like the New York Times, they can muster all of their resources to cover the world of the virus, as can the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. Other smaller newspapers and digital outlets are contracting rather than expanding, thinning the ranks of reporters to save money as they lose this advertising. Some are slightly revived as they attract more people who look for news on their sites. Finally, the reporters on the ground. That's what we're really talking about here. Their job is to work around the clock, much like the medical people, and go deep into the fibers of this story and outrace the virus, their health intact. Some already have been hit because you can't cover the world's biggest human interest story without human contact. 6 CBS journalists tested positive last week, 1 in Italy. Where would we be if a free press was not there to discover that the Wuhan virus might never have turned into a pandemic if the reporting of cases in China had been different from the beginning? Who would record the deaths in hospitals? Who would ask the hard questions? Who would interview the experts to try to get a clearer picture of what's happening with the pandemic? Who would parse the propaganda and outrageous statements coming out of the White House? Who would put out the call from frontline care workers for help? Every day we see stories about what's going on in hospitals, what kind of equipment caregivers have and don't have, and the interaction between US governors and the president, which in itself is a story. The press makes mistakes, big mistakes, but it is also on the front lines in stories like this one. Death can be one of the outcomes of staying in the trenches with a story that is dangerous and seemingly endless. As Ernie Pyle, a celebrated World War II correspondent who covered multiple fronts in World War II and died doing it, said, quote, "At last, we are up in it to our necks, and everything has changed, even your outlook on life." With that introduction, I am going to turn it over to David Shribman. Okay.
Well, good morning or good afternoon to all of you. You know, nearly centuries ago, the early penny paper, the Boston Herald, said that its raison d'etre was to give expression to the spirit of the age. Giving expression to the spirit of the age is not only an American impulse, it's a Canadian impulse as well. William Lyon Mackenzie, for example, was a printer, as newspaper owners and editors once were known. George Brown, who owned and edited the early Toronto Globe, was a major factor in the reform era's exercises of the early 19th century in free Canada. So when we talk about giving expression to the spirit of the age, we're talking about a multinational effort. It's still true, though it is also true that news outlets, from fusty old print newspapers to the shiniest new digital products, are themselves an expression of the spirit of the age. If you think of the American Civil War, for example, the photographs were an expression of the age, and they expressed the horror of the war. The committees of correspondence, which during the pre-American Revolution period created the forces that came to bear, that created the revolution and sent so many Tories into Canada, particularly into Ontario and the Maritimes. The committees of correspondence, in effect, were the early bloggers. So being the expression of the spirit of the age is what we in our business have always done. And in an age of breathless, relentless change, news outlets that once merely considered themselves chroniclers of change now find themselves either the engines of change or the victims of change. Because there would be no news, after all, if there were no world, national, neighborhood change. We now face the possibility that the remarkable pace of change today is endangering news as we know it. The coronavirus is a case in point. High-velocity events have caused high-velocity news. News outlets are scrambling to keep up and to keep ahead to fulfill their responsibility to their readers and, in some cases, to their shareholders. The challenges come from without and from within. They come from an American president who considers mainstream news outlets enemies of the people. They come from a new challenge to news outlets about how and if the president should be covered, as Cindy spoke earlier. How and if to sift out careless and untrue comments before they hit print, before they hit the airwaves. They come from disputes about what exactly the truth is, or whether there is any reasonable chance at arriving at the truth, or whether there even is such a thing as the truth. They come also from changing reading and consumption patterns. They come from new technological platforms, some of which use news, some of which abuse news. They come from the migration of advertising to the internet. They come from the expectation that news should be free. Younger generations largely have never paid a cent for news delivery. I know that from teaching my own classes at McGill. These challenges come also from news outlets themselves that challenge the veracity and the integrity of rival news services. They come from us, men and women whose need for news is undiminished, but whose patience with the purveyors of news is heightened. The evidence is everywhere in short and long-term perspectives. First, let's get the long-term. The number of newspapers in North America is down substantially. There are about a quarter fewer since 2004. The number of news reporters in conventional mainstream outlets is down substantially as well. About a quarter of news reporting jobs vanished between 2008 and 2018. The number of independent news sources is down precipitously in both the United States and Canada. The combination of the Gannett and Gatehouse chains in the US means that the new company owns 260 daily newspapers in the country. We have the same situation in Canada. Americans' trust in news reporting is way down. The Gallup organization reported that trust declined to 41% last year. And there is a worrisome partisan divide in the trust Americans have in news outlets. Democrats' trust remained the same in the past 6 years, according to the Pew Research study, but Republicans' trust in 16 of the 20 news outlets that they tested declined between 2014 and this year. The decline, the separation is less dramatic in Canada, but it exists as well. And now there's an issue of news deserts, places where there's little or no news gathering, and thus little or no shared community experience, little or no oversight of local political figures, little or no community news or high school sports reporting. But surely we can agree that some things are going on in those small towns, that there are sporting events, that local political figures are doing things, sometimes badly, that communities are holding events, or actually might hold events once this virus is done. And there's no news reporting of that. The Hussman School of Journalism and Media at the University of North Carolina recently reported that thousands of American communities are in danger of becoming news deserts. Its study found that half the 3,143 counties in the United States have only one newspaper, and that nearly 200 of them have none at all. This UNC study also speaks of ghost newspapers, a phenomenon not unknown in Canada, significantly thinned down newspapers that it characterizes as mere shells or ghosts of their former selves, adding, once standalone, iconic weeklies have merged with larger dailies and gradually disappeared. Metro, regional, and state papers have dramatically scaled back their coverage of city neighborhoods, the suburbs, and rural areas, dealing a double blow to communities that have also lost a local weekly. Now let's talk about the short-term wreckage. It's substantial, and there are reasons to believe the damage is permanent. Some news outlets have closed. The folding of the Pittsburgh Catholic newspaper, which was produced by the local diocese, and the elimination of the entire staff received enormous attention this month. Two other publications in the city, the Pittsburgh Current and Pittsburgh City Paper, asked readers for financial contributions. They weren't alone in suffering. Every one of the weeklies in Newfoundland and Labrador are closing temporarily. The Saltwire network of Halifax, Nova Scotia is temporarily laying off 40% of its workforce, an action being replicated south of the border, where pay cuts, layoffs, and furloughs are being contemplated even at some of the more robust and revered titles. There have been cutbacks and closures of niche newspapers in Washington, New York, Las Vegas, Charleston, and I must add Toronto and Montreal. A newspaper called Indie Week in Durham, North Carolina, told the following to its readers. Editorially, we don't have any events to write about, which meant we couldn't publish our calendars or cultural sections. So we had to scrap our plans and reconfigure this issue on the fly. More urgently, they continued, this week's issue marks the smallest newspaper the paper has ever published. If you find a print copy, you'll see it has very few ads. Our advertising revenue is linked to events that are no longer happening, concerts that are canceled, bars and restaurants that are closed. We're facing the prospect of weeks or months deep in the red. We need your help. And this week, a letter from publisher Dan McClory appeared on the front page of the Valley News, newspaper I know well, an outstanding newspaper produced in Lebanon, New Hampshire, with circulation reaching into parts of Vermont. This is what Dan McClory said. We're all living in a different world from a short time ago, shaped by a growing health crisis, a fragile economy, and the upheaval of our everyday lives. Here at the Valley News, we've done our best to stay on top of the news, but like nearly all businesses, we've been unable to escape its impact. We're making some painful decisions that will impact the staff that has worked tirelessly in recent weeks and beyond to bring you the news. Across our company, we are reducing expenses, which includes layoffs and a reduction of hours for some employees. Managers are taking an across-the-board pay cut. I'm going to pass to Cindy, and she'll tell you why this is happening and what its effects on a big story are.
Okay, this is a little bit more on how nonprofits have managed to keep going in this time, and the role that they have played in covering stories and how they're trying to adjust to covering a big story like this. They generally have funds that are from foundations, other organizations, probably local and national. They're sort of like a PBS on a smaller scale, public broadcasting in the US. And a lot of them just live off donations, grants. So they've sprung up to compete with or complement or replace legacy news organizations. A study by Harvard's Neiman Lab found that 90% of them depend on philanthropy. The most successful likely are ProPublica and the Texas Tribune, and credible outlets such as The Intercept, the Min-Post in Minnesota, Public Source in Pittsburgh, Cal Matters in California, and Florida Bulldog. They've all made important contributions to news and their communities. Sports fans are watching The Athletic, which has raised millions in private financing and rated newspaper sports departments for their best staff. But overall, the situation is so dire that the Lenfest Institute for Journalism, the Facebook Journalism Project, and the Local Media Association teamed up on March 17th to offer a total of $1 million in grants to support local news organizations covering the coronavirus crisis in the US and Canada. They realized that these organizations simply didn't have enough money to keep going and have the resources. So a week later, the groups sponsoring this had 900 applications. The few big legacy newspapers like the New York Times, which I mentioned earlier, that bet a lot of money on promoting digital readership have succeeded to an extent. The New York Times now has 5 million subscribers, and they are by and large elites. Elites buy the paper. They can afford the paper, and their liberal, well-educated views largely align with the papers. In fact, the line of demarcation between struggling and mid-sized newspapers and giants like the Times have created what Linda Polgreen, a former top editor at the Times and editor-in-chief at HuffPost, called a kind of media inequality that mirrors society. And as you know, everyone has views on the pandemic, who caused it, what the effect is it real, what are we going to do about it? So in an interview with the Atlantic magazine, she said, these legacy news organizations, their core audience are the wealthiest, best informed, most educated, most spoiled for choice news consumers. She said she wanted to work on digital news in her new job for people who were never going to become subscribers of the New York Times. Many metropolitan newspapers may be experiencing a surge in online subscriptions because of readers' thirst for information about the coronavirus. This certainly is the case at papers such as the Portland Press Herald in Maine and the Seattle Times in Washington State. But news executives worry that consumers have grabbed inexpensive trial subscriptions and will abandon the websites and the papers when the trial period ends. You know how that goes with Amazon Prime. And when the virus threat subsides, they'll be gone. So no one's really counting on that new revenue. That also means that fewer reporters will be there because they'll be cut or furloughed or just reassigned. Just as worrisome, Joel Simon, executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, wrote in the Columbia Journalism Review that the virus is a, quote, spawning a global press freedom crackdown. Plus this, those who depend on social media for news consumption are likely the least informed people. That's the finding of a new study released this week from the Pew Research Center, but there's even more troubling news in the study. More than half who rely most on social media for political news say they have encountered made-up news about COVID-19. Robert Rutland, who was the erudite editor of the papers of James Madison, concluded in an important 1973 book on journalism in the life of the United States with this thought: before the purveying of information becomes a lost art, the newsmongers must accept the fact that the real test of professionalism is not whether one can protect sources or hang out a shingle, but how well one performs a task that is vital to society. If he were writing that book today, he would add 4 words: and not lose money, and I add these, doing it.